the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory to Jesus Christ. In today's reading from the prophecy of Isaiah, we revisit a theme that we heard in the first chapters of Isaiah near the beginning of Lent, where in those early chapters, the Lord speaks through his prophet to the people of Israel about how their observances of the law, the feasts, the liturgical observances, are not pleasing before him because of the sinfulness and injustice of their lives. And so today, in a section particularly relevant to this season of fasting, we hear the Lord also speaking through his prophet to those of the people of Israel who say, "Look, we've fasted, we've prayed, but you have not answered us." The prophet delivers the word of the Lord that because you have not kept these principles of love and care for neighbor, have not lived your lives righteously, your fasts and outward observances do not attain their purpose. And so he lays out what is still lacking. Do not oppress those who work for you. Do not exploit them. Release them from their oppression. Share your food with the hungry. Take in those who have no place. If you see one who has no clothing, give to him. And these are presented as the foundations for true fasting and prayer. One thing that's striking about these, when we hear these passages, we sometimes think of them as calling us to some great humanitarian cause. And to be sure, such causes are a vocation for some, are ways that some people do great good in the world. But if we read them, if you reread these exhortations of the prophet, there's an immediacy to them. Do not oppress your laborers. Do not do injustice to those who work for you. Share your food with the hungry. If you see a man who needs clothing, give to him. And so what we hear spoken of primarily here is this call to do the good that lies before us, to be attentive to the needs of those in our own life, and if we are really attentive to these, we often find that we don't need to go very far in looking for people in need of help, of compassion, of being shown Christian love. And so this is, I said already, a foundation of true fasting and true prayer. And yet, fasting and prayer can also lead us into this showing of love for those whom God sets before us. Because fasting, the disciplines of prayer, are an opportunity to set aside our single-minded focus on our own needs and desires, and to open up our hearts to perceive what God has set before us to do, and having so opened them, seeing the good that lies before us, in not then leaving it undone, we open our hearts yet further to receive the grace of God and to encounter Him in a new and a profound way. There's a passage from the Ladder of Divine Ascent, this work of St. John Climacus, that gives us the theme for one of the Sundays of Lent, in which he's been speaking of the glories of the monastic life, of the great spiritual depths available to us in it, or to those who pursue it. And then he says, and I'll read from the book here, "Some people living carelessly in the world put a question to me. How can we who are married and living amid public cares aspire to the monastic life? I answered, do whatever good you may. Speak evil of no one, rob no one, tell no lie. Despise no one, carry no hate. Do not separate yourself from the church assemblies. Show compassion to the needy. Do not be a cause of scandal to anyone. Stay away from the bed of another, and be satisfied with what your own wives, or you might generalize it, your own spouses, can provide you. If you do all this, you will not be far from the kingdom of heaven." And so he presents that not just as a, if you can't attain to the spiritual heights of monasticism, here's some nice things you can do. But this is his answer to how can we who are living among the cares of the world aspire to these spiritually great things that you've spoken of, speaking of the monastic life. And so the implication is that if we really wholeheartedly do the good that lies before us, if we really wholeheartedly strive to set our lives aright in our own immediate circumstances, then that paves the way for us to experience the grace of God, not perhaps in quite the same way, but in a way that is truly comparable to that great manifestation of grace that comes through these great monastic spiritual labors about which the latter speaks in such detail. In the reading from Genesis today, we hear a section from the story of Joseph in Egypt. And these readings from Genesis in the later part of Lent are really just little glimpses of the stories from that later part, but it is of great spiritual benefit for all of us to enter into these stories deeply, to study them, and indeed, in the bridegroom matins services of Holy Week, we'll come back to this remembrance, Joseph in Egypt. Now, Joseph was placed in a situation far from ideal or desirable. He was thrown into a pit by his brothers, then taken out and sold as a slave and taken away to Egypt. And Joseph, in this situation, did the good that was before him. He was a slave in the house of Potiphar in Egypt, and he did all of his duties with great care, great diligence, and in the midst of temptation, he preserved his chastity even at great cost to himself. And then in prison, again, through his diligence in seeking to do the good before him. He had great trust placed in him, and when his fellow prisoners came to him for wisdom and guidance, he provided to them what understanding he could. And through this, through being remembered by one of the men that he had helped in prison, he was brought out of prison, brought into the court of Pharaoh, and given this great work which he pursued with similar diligence of preserving not only the people of Egypt, but the people of the surrounding lands and even his own family from the terrible famine that struck the land. And so, remembering the words of the prophet Isaiah, and remembering this wondrous story of Joseph in Egypt that concludes the book of Genesis, let us strive in all things to do the good that lies before us, to set our lives aright, to be ever attentive to the needs of those whom God has placed before us in our lives. And in doing what good God has set for us to do, to aspire to a greater knowledge of God, which is not something that lies in an escape from the perhaps mundane things that lie before us, but is found through our showing diligence and love in the immediate good that God has given us. And through these things, he will reveal his grace and his mercy and his love in ways that are now beyond our comprehension. To him be all glory, honor, and worship, now and ever, to the ages of ages. Amen.